The 1954 Senate subcommittee hearings on comic books got a lot of press, got a lot of publicity, and had the potential for creating some major problems for the comic book publishers, because it really seemed that there was a real danger of government censorship of the material, and there was an even bigger danger of lost sales. Remember, 70% of Americans at this point believed that comic books were responsible, at least in part, for the surge, or the perceived surge, in juvenile delinquency. Oh, by the way, this is Frederick Wortham right here in the picture, giving his testimony. Anyway, the comics companies decided to do something that had previously been done by other industries, like the movie industry, for example, in the 1920s, like college sports, actually, in the 1900s, with the formation of the NCAA. That is, to create a self-regulatory system, to introduce voluntary self-censorship, so as to preempt the government getting immediately and actively involved. So is that going to mean less censorship than the government would have? Maybe, maybe not. But what it would mean is the ability to tell parents that we have heard your concerns and we are taking measures to regulate the content of this material. And this led to the creation of what's known as the Comics Code Authority, which again was signed off on by the various publishers, some more reluctantly than others, as an independent entity that would censor the comics, that would approve or disapprove. You got to now get it past the censors, and the Comics Code Authority actually had 5 full-time censors whose job, I guess 40 hours a week, was reading comic books and picking out stuff that wasn't going to be allowed. And if they found stuff that wasn't allowed, they would send it back, and changes would have to be made. Unless those changes were made, the comic book would not get this stamp, which wasn't like, a stamp that was licked and affixed to the cover. It was part of the cover. But every comic book, basically, that was going to be distributed nationally, that was going to be delivered to newsstands and comic book racks, would have to have this stamp on it. And the distributors signed off on this. So if you publish the comic book, you have it printed, you are reliant upon the distributors, right? Because, let's say, for example, Timely Comics, at this point known as Atlas, they don't have 2,000 people driving trucks to go deliver their comic books, right? They're reliant on a company that does that. And if they did not get this stamp, then those trucks are not going to carry their bundles of comics and deliver them, and they're going to lose that money. So this stamp would appear in the upper right-hand corner of everything that's distributed through newsstands, beginning in 1954, when this was established. So there on the left, there's a 1955 issue of Batman, stamp included. There's an issue of Amazing Spider-Man, which did not exist in 1955. That's from 1967. And all the way up through the 70s and 80s, this thing was affixed to anything that was sold in regular stores. Now, the date there says 1954 to 2011. So just to give you kind of a brief history, because we're going to talk about some of these things more later on. Standards relaxed a little bit in the 70s, a little bit. But by the 1980s, comic book specialty shops, comic stores were opening. And those were not the same thing as newsstands or comic racks in grocery stores and gas stations and drugstores and stuff. So you didn't have to have the stamp to be carried through a comics specialty shop. By the 1990s, some companies were not even bothering because there weren't that many comics being sold anymore at gas stations, pharmacies, grocery stores, and so on. By 2001, in the year 2001, Marvel dropped the stamp. A couple of other companies kept using it for about 10 more years after that. DC Comics and Archie Comics continued to carry the stamp until January 2011 when they dropped it too, and for all intents and purposes, the CCA was then dead. But it was not dead for a long time. It was in full force for about 40 years, and then gradually declined over the next 15 years or so after that. Well, what are some of the things that censors would no longer allow? The original 1954 guidelines included the prohibition of the very words crime, horror, or terror in the title of a comic book. They forbade such things as, extremely gruesome or violent scenes, nudity, even the hint of illicit sex or of sexual perversion, which was a euphemism for homosexuality. They also literally forbade the use of vampires, werewolves, or zombies. Also ghouls and cannibalism. Can't even have it in the story, let alone the title. No occult storylines. Crime must not pay, so any criminal action has to be presented in a negative light, and the criminal cannot get away with it. And romance has to be wholesome, right? No illicit sex. That means no premarital sex. And again, it said not even a hint of premarital or extramarital sex. And this is going to be enforced, like I said, by the distributors. Well, how is this going to look if it gets put to the test? And perhaps an even bigger question, who would be the first company to challenge this comics code? Well, I know it's going to come as a huge surprise to you, but that company would be EC Comics. And it would come about due to a story that first appeared in Weird Fantasy, issue 18 in March 1953. The story was called Judgment Day. It was written by Al Feldstein and illustrated by Joe Orlando. As you can see, it wasn't the cover story. The cover story was an adaptation of a short story by Ray Bradbury. I hope you recognize that name, but I realize you might not. If you don't, Ray Bradbury was one of the all-time greats of science fiction. Not science fiction comics, but science fiction, period. Well, you may be asking yourself, wait a second, what's up with that date, March 1953? This is a full year, more than a year, before those Senate hearings. So how can this have any effect or be affected by the Comics Code Authority? Well, it wasn't when it first came out. In fact, it was greeted with critical acclaim when it initially came out. including high praise from Ray Bradbury himself, who, as I mentioned, was already a huge name, as you can see there on the cover page, America's top science fiction writer. So it was very well received. The problem came about later when they tried to reprint it. But before we talk about that, let's just actually take a look at the story, and we're going to look at some images from the story. Like I said, it was called Judgment Day, and it takes place in the future, and this astronaut is visiting a planet that is inhabited by sentient robots, and the astronaut represents a consortium of sorts of kind of like the United Federation of Planets in Star Trek. And the robot planet has petitioned for membership to be a part of these United Planets. Anyway, so the astronaut is here representing that United Planet situation. The robots are being tested, essentially. That's the Judgment Day. They're being judged as to whether they are sufficiently advanced to be allowed membership in the greater community of planets. So, the astronaut's name is Tarleton, and he is given a tour by a robot representative, and the robots are orange. Well, most of them are. Turns out, as Tarleton discovers, there are also blue robots. The blue robots are the ones who do the servile work, the manual labor. They're not allowed in positions of leadership. They're not allowed the same rights as the orange robots. In fact, they're confined to a certain part of town, Blue Town. And Tarleton wants to go see Blue Town, so the orange guy, he's a little reluctant, because he doesn't go to Blue Town himself that much. They have to keep them differentiated, otherwise there'd be trouble. Have to keep them in their place. As you can see here on the right, they're segregated at the bus stop. There's orange seating and blue seating. Well, Tarleton asks questions and discovers that essentially they're the same kind of robot. The only difference is A, some are blue and some are orange, and B, the blue ones receive different programming. They receive less sophisticated programming. Well, Tarleton's a little taken aback by this. I thought you said you had a free enterprise society, but apparently that doesn't include the blue robots. And the orange guide says, quote, "You're lecturing me as though all this were my fault, Tarleton. This existed long before I was made. What can I do about it? I'm only one robot." Well, Tarleton has to deliver the unfortunate news to the orange robots that no, they are not advanced enough to be invited into the community of civilized planets, because they got this issue, this social issue with the differentiation between orange and blue robots. But Tarleton says, don't worry about it. It's okay. This is something you can change. You can work to change, because, on my planet, we had something similar to this, but we eventually fixed it. So then Tarleton leaves, and as the spaceship takes off, finally, for the first time during the story, Tarleton takes off his helmet, and you see that he is a black man. And the final panel says, "And inside the ship, the man removed his space helmet and shook his head, and the instrument lights made the beads of perspiration on his dark skin twinkle like distant stars." So this is one of those Twilight Zone type endings, Andrew Knight, Shyamalan type endings, although it came before those things, where there's a twist, right? There's a twist at the end, and suddenly, looking at this last panel and realizing for the first time the astronaut was black, puts the entire story in a completely different light. And like I said, the story was very well received in 1953. Well, fast forward almost 3 years. Al Feldstein was putting together material for the 33rd issue of Incredible Science Fiction with a cover date of January 1956. Now, this means that it would actually be on stands probably in November 1955. The comic book, by the way, up through issue 29 had been called Weird Science Fantasy, but with issue 30 they had changed the name because weird, after those hearings, was kind of frowned on. So with issue 30 it had become Incredible Science Fiction. This is why there are only four issues of Incredible Science Fiction under that title. Anyway, the issue was to include a story written and illustrated by Angelo Torres. Now, Angelo Torres was he was a friend of Al Williamson and Frank Frazetta, and had helped out on some of their stuff with inks and stuff. This was going to be his first solo story, doing full pencils and inks, and also writing the story for EC. It was called An Eye for an Eye. And the setting is a dystopian, post-apocalyptic, post-nuclear Armageddon future in which most of the survivors have been affected in one way or another by the radiation and mutated into into mutants. There's fish people and I guess bird people, but there's this couple here whose names are, as it turns out, Joseph and Mary, who are, quote, normal humans. And they are, so far as they know, the last normal humans left. But they've heard now that there is a colony of normal humans that's out there. And so they set out to try to find them, but they're objects of hatred by all the, well, I guess you would call them mutants and mutates, because they're so weird, because they're normal humans, right? They're freaks, therefore. So they're being chased as the story opens. As the story progresses, it kind of follows their travails as they're being chased by these mutants. And then the woman winds up getting killed, and then the man goes on alone, and then finally reaches his destination, this lost colony of normal humans. But they're not normal humans. They also are mutants. They're kind of like these fish creatures, and they also don't respond well to seeing this weird normal human looking guy, and they attack him with spears, and they're stabbing him, right? And then the final panel, this is all second person. You watch fascinated, waiting for death, and somehow even then the pride persists in you. At least you die a man. You're not a freak like them. You lie there face down in the riverbank mud, and you watch as the spear comes down, and you don't even blink your third eye. So, this last panel pulls it all together, right? So here's this guy and his now late female companion, who had this sense of superiority. They're the normal ones. Everyone else is a freak. but they're normal. And they didn't want to be with the freaks, and the freaks didn't want them. So they're trying to find other normal people. And when it doesn't work and the freaks are killing them, then the guy, he dies face down in the mud, still being smug, and saying, well, you know what, I'm maybe dying, but at least I'm human. I'm normal, not a freak like you are. And then, he's got an eyeball between his shoulder blades, which seems perfectly normal to him. But really it's not. See, the point is, he's had this smug attitude of superiority, but really he's no different than all the other people around him. And the hatred they all have for one another over these perceived differences is unwarranted. Censors didn't like that. Censors didn't like that because they were going a little bit beyond the original intent of the Comics Code Authority to tone down violence and sex. They were trying to tone down anything that might conceivably be controversial, and it really seemed like this story was trying to say, maybe white people aren't superior. That seemed to be the message. Maybe they think they are, but they're really not. Well, that's not going to go over well in the South, and maybe other parts of the country, the censors said. So the censors failed this one. They said, you can't run this unless you take out that last panel, which would be destroying the whole point of the story. Well, now they're in kind of a bind. So Angelo Torres doesn't get to get his big EC debut. Torres, by the way, is still alive and still working. He was about, I think he was 24 years old at that time. In the 60s, he worked for Warren Publications, working in those horror black and white magazines we've talked about. And by the late 60s, he was getting regular work at Mad Magazine, where he would work for decades afterward. So he did all right, but he didn't get his big EC debut. And this puts Al Feldstein in a bind, because this comic has to go out, and it's short a story. So they're going to have to reprint something, take something they've previously published and use it to fill in the gap. And he had kind of a 2-for-1 sort of idea. There's a story that they'd published, Judgment Day, that was critically acclaimed. So that would be certainly suitable, one would think, to replace this one. And it also had the same theme as this one. So it was decided to go with Judgment Day as the replacement for An Eye for an Eye, but it also ran up against the censors. And the censor they go up against is this guy, a judge named Charles Murphy, who's in charge of the CCA overall. He's the administrator. Here he is from a newspaper article demonstrating how their censorship works, right? The before picture looked a little too, distorted, and so he made the artist change it so that the monster just looks like a grumpy lady. So anyway, he tells Feldstein, no, you can't do Judgment Day either, because of that last panel. Again, the last panel, because he's a black guy. That is going to offend Southerners. Why is it going to offend them? It's going to have a double layer of offense, really. A, it's implying that black people are smart enough to be astronauts. And B, the story implies that segregation and racism are somehow wrong. Now, this is a huge stretch, right? There was nothing in the deliberations about this, other than the fact race did come up during those Senate hearings. That was one of the things that Frederick Wortham complained about comic books, was the racist caricatures and stereotypes of minorities, which he was actually onto something, in a big way there. Particularly, he pointed out the Asian stereotypes. So this is like the opposite of the intent, but they're not wanting any offense at all, any potential for any controversy that could lead to lost sales for the other companies that are involved in this enterprise. So he says no to that, and as we will see in a moment, we've got a nice juicy quote. Gaines and Feldstein push back, and then Judge Murphy relents and says, okay, you can have the black guy, but you can't have the perspiration on his skin sparkling like the stars. You can't have the sweat. Maybe because it made it look like, either because it made it look like maybe he was crying, maybe it was just like not really all perspiration, crying because racism is sad, or perhaps because that whole twinkling like the stars on his dark skin implied some kind of inherent nobility in this guy who was clearly a black guy. Either way, you gotta get rid of the sweat at least. Well, here's our quote from Al Feldstein years later. It's full of saucy language. I'll let you read that to yourself. It kind of continues what I just said, but finally, ultimately, what it came down to was that Bill Gaines told Judge Murphy, "F you," and hung up on him. Now, the judge did relent, reluctantly, and they did allow Incredible Science Fiction 33 to go out with the stamp on it. But after this, that FU from Bill Gaines was not just a momentary fit of passion. It was a large, philosophical, existential FU to the Comics Code Authority and to censorship. And we know this because Incredible Science Fiction 33 was the last comic book that EC Comics ever released. They canceled their entire line of comics except for Mad. And Mad, they retooled. They retooled and changed around so that beginning with issue 24, it was not a comic book. It was not a four-color comic, but rather it was a magazine, the same size as most other magazines on the magazine shelf. And it was black and white, not four-color, so that it could not be mistaken for a comic book, despite the fact that it had sequential art all through it, right? Continued with the movie and television parodies, as well as some text-centered things. But the main reason for all this was, as a magazine, it was not sold on the spinner racks. It wouldn't fit on the racks where the comic books were. So therefore, it was not subject to the Comics Code Authority and could not be censored by them. Well, that was another step. That was another level. That was leveling up on the big FU from Bill Gaines. And Mad Magazine would continue to say FU to the establishment for many decades to come, and would also be the first example of this black and white magazine that's really a comic book, but isn't technically classified as a comic book. I've mentioned before the Warren Publications magazines in the 1960s. They had war magazines and they had horror magazines that were not subject to the Comics Code Authority. because they technically weren't comic books. All right, well, we've already talked about the fact that Bill Gaines remained the publisher of Mad until he passed away in 1992. This is how I remember Bill Gaines from when I was a kid, as he appeared frequently in the editorial page of Mad magazine. Finally passed away in 1992. Now here's something else I've mentioned before that this is a good time to mention again, and that is Cracked magazine. Mad switched over to a black and white magazine in 1956. 2 years later, Cracked came along, which many of you may have never even heard of as a magazine, but you've probably heard of Cracked.com, which was initially the website of the magazine. The magazine finally folded in the early 2000s, but the website lives on. Anyway, Cracked was one of only many imitators of Mad, many efforts to capture part of that audience, and none of them did. But Cracked magazine was willing to admit that. In fact, they advertised themselves sarcastically as the world's second greatest humor magazine. So that wasn't me saying that. That was part of their ad campaign for many years. Mad had as its mascot Alfred E. Newman, the toothy guy on the front cover. Cracked had the janitor Sylvester P. Smythe. It was widely reported in July 2019, after Mad, which was by then owned by Warner Brothers, had been bought out by AT&T, that the magazine was effectively shutting down. There were rumors of a complete cancellation. Actually, what happened is that as of the December 2019 issue, that was the last issue that would be sold on newsstands. So you could no longer go to Walmart or Kroger or any place like that and see Mad magazine. It is still sold in comic shops, and you can still subscribe to it, but most of the material in it from January 2020 on is reprinted from previous decades, although there is some new material here and there. There's going to be some specials with new material. Cracked, meanwhile, like I said, they went under finally in 2007. So 49 years Cracked was able to hang in there, and they still are in a way at Cracked.com. So both of these two, the two big humor magazines, or the one big one and the one second best, still around in one form or another. Unlike the majority, the huge number of competitors that they had over the years. However, you now know the story of how Mad Magazine came to be and what a debt is owed for its existence as we have known it to Dr. Frederick Wortham.